Versus the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill S-3875.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 3875, an act to require the President to develop and maintain products that show the risk of natural hazards across the United States and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on S-3875.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman has the floor.
The Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act, led by Congresswoman Sharice Davids in the House, will enable the Federal Emergency Management Agency to identify the communities most in need of mitigation projects and to help them access the necessary funding and support to complete such projects. Climate change and development in high-risk zones has created a never-ending stream of disaster impacts that cause billions of dollars in damage around the country, which taxpayer dollars must cover. This legislation will help protect communities and reduce the financial burden on taxpayers by targeting mitigation investments to communities that have the fewest resources to invest in resilience and are expected to incur the greatest amount of disaster damage. By directing the Federal Emergency Management Agency to publicly designate the most in need and at-risk census tracts as community disaster resilience zones, stakeholders can effectively target mitigation investments to these communities and make them more resilient. This legislation also authorizes federal cost share flexibility for building infrastructure and communities grant project applicants in designated community disaster resilience zones. I urge my colleagues to support the Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as such time as I may consume.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of S-3875, the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act of 2022, which amends the Stafford Act to include a section on natural disaster risk assessment. This bill's intent is to make the public more aware of the inherent risks of disasters that may affect their communities. It directs the President or FEMA to maintain a publicly available risk assessment program that shows what hazards pose the most threat to communities. It also directs the President or FEMA to provide financial or technical assistance to communities in designated community disaster resilience zones. Establishing these zones will help communities, states, and the private sector better plan investments in mitigation. I urge support and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the congressional record a letter of support for S-3875 signed by 32 organizations.
Without objection.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask my colleague, are there any speakers? I'm prepared to close.
We have no further speakers.
Are you prepared to close? Okay, I'll go.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for his close. The floor is yours.
What if I change my mind, Mr. Speaker?
Well, then I'll have to say something.
What's the time I might have left, Mr. Speaker, if I may inquire?
The gentleman from Illinois has 19 minutes remaining.
That's the best clock action I've had here, Mr. Speaker, in my 10 years. I've never had that much time left. I've always talked more than this. So therefore,
when they know you're on a short time, they have minutes to it.
well, Mr. Speaker, now I only have 18 and a half minutes to close. Get ready. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the chair of the subcommittee that I've been blessed to serve on as ranking member on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, I want to thank each of you for working with us in a bipartisan way to move this bill forward. Disaster resiliency matters in a district like mine that encompasses the Illinois and Mississippi River Basin. We see disasters on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, when I got to this institution 10 years ago, one of the first votes I had to take was on funding Superstorm Sandy relief. And I remember saying the first time that I had a chance to talk about disaster assistance as a brand new freshman, my comments were, if the federal government should do something right, it's helping communities recover from disasters that they had no control over. This is another good bipartisan step to make sure that that happens in communities all across this nation, from Montana to Washington, D.C., to Illinois and elsewhere. So I want to say thank you again. I urge support of this fine piece of legislation, and I'll yield back my 16 and a half minutes.
The gentleman yields back his 16 and a half minutes of time. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, this bill will also help my district, which has built on the rivers and where disaster resilience is most needed. In closing, we know that investments in mitigation measures save up to $11 for every $1 spent. This legislation will save taxpayer dollars by investing in mitigation and protecting vulnerable communities. I thank my colleague, Sharice Davids, for her work on this issue, and I support this targeted, data-driven approach. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 3875? Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, for what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek